Hi there, I'm Evan Troxel. Welcome to my podcast about how technology is changing the architectural profession. Welcome back to the show. My name is Evan Troxel. On this episode, I had the pleasure of having a conversation with Scott Davidson. Scott is in charge of business development at McNeel and Associates, and they make a small piece of software that you might have heard of called Rhinoceros, also known as Rhino. And in typical McNeel fashion, they just quietly released version 7 in an email, basically a one-liner letting everybody know that it's out. And this is a very big deal. It's a very big deal to McNeel. It's also a very big deal to the AEC profession in that Rhino plays such a pivotal role in geometry creation and translation between products that we use on a day-to-day basis. In this conversation, we get into why this is a big deal. We also talk about how this all came to be. So we do a little bit of a trip down memory lane. And it's funny because it's actually very Bob Ross, if you know who that is, in that it's a series of happy little accidents. So it was a true pleasure to speak to Scott, who has been at McNeel and Associates for 28 years now, which is just incredible. I love that there's so much embedded knowledge in that team and that they stick around and continue to deliver what people are asking for and really engage with the community of professionals. So without further ado, I hope you enjoy my conversation with Scott. Scott Davidson, welcome to the podcast. It's great to have you here.
Yeah, thanks. Thank you for having me.
And for those of you out there who don't know who Scott is, which is doubtful, I think the audience of this podcast probably does know about one of the most important pieces of software in the AEC industry. And you know, this show is all about how technology is changing the profession of architecture. We do talk a lot about the other E's and C's out there on this show as well, but that's where you're stationed right now, and maybe you could give a little bit of a backstory on McNeel, on Rhino, and where you've come from.
Yeah, well, thanks. Rhino is you know, I guess you could call it a happy accident, really.
Yeah.
You know, oddly enough, you know, we were AutoCAD dealers. I don't know. I've worked for McNeel for 28 years, and so it's been a while.
Yeah.
But we were AutoCAD dealers and developers, and we started to work on a NURBS modeler, a NURBS engine, actually in AutoCAD. That's where Rhino started. And you know, it was hard in those days, much harder than it is today, but hard in those days to get 3D in AutoCAD.
Oh yeah.
Now there wasn't much of any. Yeah, I mean, you had kind of 3D faces.
The 3D face command. I mean,
that's right. Well, and you know, how do you get NURBS in there and all the tools and things like that? So as we were hooking that up, we developed a little test harness, just a little Windows app, had 4 viewports, something we could pick in and spin around. And what we were doing was using that as a quicker way to actually prototype commands. And so, you know, how do these commands work? And one of the things that's really key to how we work is, you know, customers need to be involved. They need to test stuff before it's done. They need to, you know, really help us along with what's important. It's been kind of part of what we do forever. So we had this little test harness, this little Windows app. And then when we got it right, then what we would do is we would put it in AutoCAD. Mm-hmm. And we were kind of going along, and all of a sudden we realized that while everybody was using the test app, the little harness, they didn't really care if it got into AutoCAD. Like everybody started concentrating on the test harness because they were doing some work, you know, and they were actually working in those. And we thought, wow, I wonder if we have something here, you know, like what would happen if we actually made the test harness an application.
Wow.
And Rhino was born.
What a cool story.
Yeah, it was crazy. It was just crazy.
So where did that name come from?
One of the original developers at, 2 a.m, like we always do, or like a lot of developers do, they're kind of looking around for a code name.
Yeah.
And there was I don't know if you've ever seen it. There's a etching of a rhino from somebody had gone to India and then on the ship had described what a rhino looked like. And they had this, that older etching where the rhino looks like a tank. It had that hanging on his wall. And he's like, oh, I'll call it rhino for a while. Rhinoceros, right? We'll just call it Rhinoceros.
Just for a while, yeah.
Just for a while. So we're getting, we go through the whole discovery process of that we should have an application maybe. And so now we're going to have everybody on the forum and us choose a name. Names are hard. They have to be translatable. They have to be, international. They have to not be used. And of course, we're doing the solid this and the accu that and the all those standard names that everybody knows. CAD this, whatever. And anyway, in the end, everybody's like, don't change it.
Just leave it. Yeah.
Just leave it. And, we're thinking we're going to get in trouble for not being professional and all that kind of stuff. But we did it, and it's worked. And rhinoceros is a rhinoceros in almost every language.
Yeah.
And yeah, it's actually worked out. And then then we get caught up in the whole zoo naming thing, and that's been out of control.
Yes. Fun,
but out of control.
It's always a topic of discussion whenever a new animal or species comes out of the woodwork into the rhino zoo kind of landscape.
That's right. The tree sloth, the bongo. What's a bongo? We're all looking on Google to figure it out. Anyway.
It's kind of a point of pride, I think, for developers to find a new animal as well that also works with what they're doing.
Right? Never thought about that. That's right. Got to look at. That's right. You can develop on Rhino and learn at the same time.
So the name was an accident. The product was an accident. I mean, you guys are quite a crew there.
Yeah, the whole thing is an accident. I'm telling you.
It's like an episode of Gilligan's Island or something.
Well, we'll get into it a little bit later, I'm sure. But it's one of the things I cannot. We don't underestimate, but you have to be really clear on this that the people that participate in this, customers that test this, that are on the forums, that are trying the new stuff. It's just as much their product as ours. We if we didn't have people kind of banging on us and looking at the new stuff and giving us feedback, we really wouldn't know where to go. And so it's just as much influenced by everybody that uses it as it is by us. And that's that's intentional to do that, but also it's an adventure.
Yeah.
So it's a journey. I mean, I can tell you, I never thought we'd be here where we are now.
Right, of course. Yeah, I was just having a conversation with another person for the podcast, and we were talking about how easy it is. It's the famous Steve Jobs quote that you can connect the dots going backwards, but you can't connect them going forwards, right? Yeah.
No, we're terrible at predicting the future. Right. There's no question about that. Yeah.
Well, let's go back in history for another moment here. So I have, and I mentioned this to you in email, but I have a SIGGRAPH story from probably the late 90s. I can't remember exactly when I was there.
It was the late 90s, probably 96, 97.
Yes, exactly. Yes. And so you and I can arm wrestle. I was a Form Z user from 94-ish, right? When I was in college. And it was like version 2 at the time. I got my first Power PC Macintosh, and I was running it on there. And I was just so excited about technology. I had always had been as a kid. My dad had some early K-Pro, IBM clone, and we had an Apple IIe and stuff like that. And so I had learned, I had a Commodore, like early days, like programming stuff and basically programming at that stage for me was just copying something out of a book and trying to make it into like a direct copy to play a game or something like that.
Right.
And so then going into college, got my first like proper Macintosh, with the GUI, and we had a PC lab, and I was learning 3D Studio and AutoCAD. I wish it was AudioCAD. That'd be better. But I went to SIGGRAPH, and I started using like Electric Image for my 3D renderings and stuff because I was a Mac user, and so 3D Studio was only running in DOS at the time. It wasn't a real thing for me, and I know you guys were on the Windows side. And I walked by your booth, okay, and I think it was probably you and Bob or something like that. And
Brian Gillespie probably, and I don't know, maybe Dale. I mean, there's all these people still work there.
Yeah.
Right.
I know. And I remember that they had like I believe it was actually a laptop running Rhino with a car fender demo. It was like showing how the car fender and the continuity of the curves lined up with the door panel, and you guys had the zebra pattern on there to show the surface continuity. And I was like, I'm an architect. Like, this is cool software. And you guys, I mean, it was one of those things where it was seriously like, how, like everybody struggles with their booth. How do we get people to stop here? Right.
Right.
And it was like, I was headed to the Electric Image booth or something, or, and I think it was funny because like at that time it was like Electric Image was running on Sun Microsystems computer. Like anybody was ever going to use it that way. But, but it was just a fun moment in time where it's like, it was the Wild West of 3D modeling, of CAD applications. And for me, like learning Form Z early on, so I had probably been using Form Z at that point for 3 or 4 years, and it was like a solids modeler, and that's all I cared about at that point, right? And so when Rhino comes, when I walk by the booth and it surfaces, I'm like, I have no use for this. Okay, so because we weren't doing like there was architecture back then for us was very rectilinear. Like that's for the most part. It was Morphosis, like Morphosis was a huge Form Z shop at the time.
Right.
And that's what we were all looking at. And so now it is completely the opposite, right? Like now it's just Rhino in AEC is absolutely everywhere, and Form Z is nowhere, even though it is still a thing. It totally is. And I met Chris, and I know David who runs it now, and it's just interesting to kind of see how times change, and you can never be assured of anything. But what a crazy history you guys have had to where you are now with like your background. You're showing up. You're talking about Rhino.Inside, right? Like, who saw that? It was
yet again that was a surprise to us. But just to kind of back that up, because it's the funny part about that car fender demo, which is one of the very first ones we did. It is actually only the car fender, right? The rest of the car doesn't exist.
Yes. But, right.
I want to be clear about that one.
Nope, there was no car.
No. But we were, we're in Seattle, so the marine industry was a big one. So the marine industry was really pushing us to do a lot of the crazy shapes that they couldn't do anywhere else. And so that was big, and industrial designers, of course, and people that were doing those kinds of pieces. And that was pretty clear that was going to be something that we did early on, and we did. And then I don't know, it was the first day, maybe it was the second day we're selling Rhino. We get a phone call from Frank Gehry's office.
Did you?
And on Frank Gehry's,
they smelled it in the air or something.
Something, right? So
there was no social media.
No, Frank Gehry's personal credit card. He bought Rhino, and Bob and I looked at each other and we said, well, that was that market saturated. Yeah. Because nobody was doing this crazy stuff.
Right.
And we're done with that one. Right. And yes. And so then we were off into all these other markets, and it is interesting that we've been pulled back into architecture.
Yeah. As a general purpose modeler, right? Jewelry design, marine design, automotive design, like all of those things. Similar story with Form Z. Like they had a small contingent of architectural users, and probably because they had a stair tool, like more than anything, right? It was like, and walls with thickness that you could change. That was like the main pull for us, and being able to punch windows and things pretty easy. Their Booleans were great. And so building a general purpose modeler, and then somehow, like you just said, like, now you've been pulled back into this heavily architecturally oriented piece of software. That's I would imagine you have a lot of users there.
Oh yeah. I mean, architecture is by far our biggest market now by a long shot.
Yeah.
And it's so big. We're just a little scratching the surface on number of architects actually using it relative to the number of architects out there. But I think the evolution of digital fabrication, of of the ability to really, if you can get an accurate shape, to be able to drive fabrication was huge in that. Mm-hmm. That's doesn't have anything to do with us other than we enable it. And then the ability, and this is an interesting one, in LOD 200, in early design stages, the ability to have flexibility of having a surface, a shape, mean anything you want is really important. And a designer wants a tool. I think a designer wants a tool that they can trust every day that they can solve the problem, the design problem, whatever it is. And they're not so worried about efficiency, and they're not so worried about let's consider it productivity, because design isn't. Yeah. So I think this idea that the tool doesn't care what it is, right? I think that is I think that's key in the overall architectural process, and especially in the design process. And so to me, it's actually the fact we don't have all this stuff that makes it possible, or it makes it a good tool for that, or at least customers think it is. And then Grasshopper comes along, and that just shot things through the roof. I mean, it was nuts.
I absolutely believe in your assessment there of the tool not caring, because that is what is actually important during the very fluid and nonlinear design process. And that's where so many people who try to shoehorn quote unquote capital D design into a product usually get it wrong. Is that, especially I think more and more nowadays, we just hear people who are really on the side of efficiency and just saying, you should do all of that in Revit. And Revit forces you to make a certain number of decisions very early on about what things are and how they should perform and how they should act. And that is absolutely not what I want in a design tool. I want something where I can have multiple iterations on the same canvas, and I can be playing with things relatively fluidly. And like you said, it just represents something. It doesn't have a lot more meaning than that necessarily. And that's really important to be able to do that. And so I agree, that is totally why tools like this make so much sense at the early stages of design, is because it's more like sculpting, it's more like play, it's more like sketching, it's more like trace paper than anything else, but that it also affords you the ability to take it as far as you want to is a testament to kind of how flexible the platform actually is, right? Is that you can use it for anything, and there really aren't any boundaries. It really is up to your imagination and maybe some at least medium skill of how to use the tools that are in there and understanding of what's possible.
Yeah, and I think it's important, even though it's early in the design process, that the surfaces have to be accurate, and because those design surfaces you make many times are informing your fabrication directly.
Right.
And so you find people that are sending the Rhino model out to fabricators, so they can, section and split and really break up the surface in the way that they need to.
Yeah.
And sometimes you have fabricators that have different processes, and so they actually need a different model. Ultimately, their LOD 350s and 400 models are different because their fabrication processes are different. And so we find it's that combination of being able to, work at any scale and make anything you want to imagine it is through your design process, but then at the same time have something accurate enough to use in fabrication. And that's really, really, at least, that's what we've been seeing.
Yeah. So, yeah, that's incredible. So, okay. So now, I mean, we're on the, dare I say, the precipice of you releasing a new version of Rhino, which is also like you guys have had kind of this, like, it seems like the releases are super compressed compared to what they were from like version 4 to 5, which seemed to be in beta forever, right? Which was awesome for users.
Years, sort of.
Yeah, sort of.
The problem is the people that wanted to, have a stable build, it didn't exist.
Yeah, that's true.
And so that was really a drawback. But that has a lot more to do with us just learning how to do this better.
Yeah. I was going to ask that, like, what's changed there? Because you guys obviously made a decision at some point to do things differently.
Yeah, what's changed. So software is kind of the result of a lot of different things, and ultimately it's a result of the team, right? Very personal, standard, everyday things that everybody deals with every day at work. And I think we just have learned as a larger organization that's been, we've had the same people for a long time, so we've been able to kind of try to get better. But I think we're learning as a group how to add features, fix things, and not kind of get distracted, or not add so much that people have to wait 5 years for a new version.
Mm-hmm.
And as we've worked with larger and larger organizations, it's become very important that we at least have some consistency to being able to bring things out in a stable version. I mean, yeah. So, Rhino 7 is going to be released on Wednesday. And so everybody can get it, but we're going to come out with Rhino 8 work in progress, maybe next month.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. So, right. And so it's, we're always having that whip version out there.
Yeah.
You have to own the previous version to download it, but and by the way, that's so key to how we develop. I mean, it's so key that people are always using what we're currently working on.
And you could only do that in today's times where downloading a 300 megabyte update for the whip, I can do it on a bi-weekly basis. Like before, when software was shipping on CD-ROMs or whatever, this just couldn't, impossible.
I believe, I'm not exactly sure. I believe we did have work in progresses early on for the beta on CDs.
Wow. So you mentioned a minute ago Grasshopper, and obviously that's a big deal. But I wanted to kind of, the overall concept of you guys being so kind of open platform with Rhino, and like you said, kind of enabling people to do, like actually creating a platform, not just a piece of software, right? You've created something where people can extend it and augment it to do whatever they need to do.
Yep.
Was that a big part of, like, I don't know the right way to say this, but like, is that really distracting when you guys are developing software? Because there's so much outside input and ideas and asks by other people to open up certain pieces to do certain things. Is that a distraction, or is that, I mean, obviously it's a core piece of who Rhino, the company, is and what the software can do, but
it's no, I mean, the answer is, it takes a very specific way of making decisions when you're putting the product together. And it is at the core of what everybody does. For instance, if they need, Rhino itself is actually mostly developed on its own public SDKs. So we develop the features on the SDK that everybody else has access to. And so many times, learning to, if this is really hard for an internal developer to do, then, they know that the proper way to do that is to actually expose more public SDK. So it makes it easier for them to develop, standard Rhino features. And in that way, it's actually not super difficult, that it's not as distracting. I can tell you what the advantage is, though. There's so many plugins, for jewelry and for marine and for, civil and, things that we have no idea about. And right. I mean, we don't have that expertise.
You don't have the bandwidth to keep up with
and there's definitely that. And so, so all these people, so and it does take a lot of time and effort to support all those developers, but it's well worth it. I don't think we wouldn't be where we are without having all the developers participate and selling product and selling plugins on top of Rhino. Yeah. And it's, yet again, it's kind of intentional, but an accident at the same time.
So how early on did you guys identify that a community was a key feature for the success of your platform, your company? Because it seems to me like it's like, this is like the core feature. Like you guys are renowned for your forum. I mean, it's the communication that happens on there is like very few other pieces of software, for instance.
Getting people involved is really important. That was really important from the day one. But then they were coming into our office and we were talking to them. Right?
The door's open.
Door's open, yeah. And I mean, and Bob. This is all Bob in this case, but getting the software out really fast and getting it in front of people and finding people that are willing to do it. There's a lot of people that was surprising to us. A lot of people that are just willing to experiment.
Yeah.
So it's very core. Part of it, I mean, you could look at it as part of it is including people. You can also look at it as efficiency. We really try to do what is useful, not necessarily, what is cool or flashy. And so having people testing it in actual production or in a safe production environment that they have, it's really key to actually making sure, for instance, we don't get distracted on things that are not as useful. And that's really hard. I mean, if you sat down and design a piece of software, it's very, very difficult to not, get distracted.
Yeah.
I really like VR, and so we're going to put a big VR piece in here, and it's hard to get that right with every decision. In fact, I'd say it's impossible because, we can't connect the dots in the future. It goes right to that same thing.
Right. Okay. So we touched on the word grasshopper a couple times. You want to tell that story about how that came to become a piece of the Rhino family?
So at that point in time, we had Rhinoscript, and Rhinoscript was a VB script interface. It was really popular. We kind of saw a lot of architects using it. It had manuals and it had pieces, but it was still code. You still had to type code. And, I hate to say it, but architects can't spell worth a darn.
I know this.
So, yes. and I have to tell you, code doesn't like that. So we're trying to think of something, and David Rutan, Grasshopper is 1,000% David Rutan's deal and his vision. And he's, continues to be the person that really holds that true. He was experimenting with other interfaces and other ideas and other ways that maybe you could make code more accessible. And Grasshopper was born out of that. People seem to like it. The interesting part was, as good as Rhinoscript was, and Rhinoscript's still around, but as good as Rhinoscript was, we would have 35 people in a class, and at the end, maybe 5, maybe 3 could really do Rhinoscript well at the end of a couple-day class. What's interesting is I can do a Grasshopper class in a day, and out of 35 people, 32 of them get it, right? They can use it, maybe in a very basic way, but they can use it. And so that really hit on a nerve that moved forward. And then just as important is, there was a plugin interface and people could develop on top of it,
right.
and all these great plugins that, again, we're no expert in all this stuff, but that was really key to now piling in so many design tools that you can mix and match.
Yeah, there's an aspect of it about creating the code in Grasshopper, and then there's also an aspect of the legibility of it, right? Where I think once you kind of understand what the components do and how inputs and outputs work, now you can actually look at a script and start to, it's like reading architecture. I think a lot of people don't necessarily think about the way people read buildings, but where's the entry? Where do I go? How do I process myself through this space? What is the space for? How is the lighting? And it's similar in this kind of thing. I'm trying to draw a connection here in my mind, but like as you kind of visually survey the code of a Grasshopper script and you're looking at what the nodes do and what they're plugged into, you can start to figure out what it does. And I bet that just makes a huge that's a big deal, because when you look at lines of code on a screen as a contrasting kind of thing, it's like it all looks the same to me, right? Like I could see a lot of people saying that. Yeah. So I'm sure that the legibility of it plays a huge part in that as well.
Yeah, and we've seen that people put their Grasshopper scripts up on the wall.
Yeah.
And use that to explain the design. Yeah. And that was a surprise for us. And before data trees, by the way, you could actually probably read it and tell, how many structural bays there were, or how many floors there were in the building, or something like that, just based on if it was graphically well organized. And, we're all designers. So we're graphic in nature. We use diagrams and sketches, and this is just one more piece of that.
I wonder if there's a correlation between like what people's scripts look like versus what their desks look like.
Well, I'm sure that's the case.
Some people are really organized, and they put things into neat little bins, and they cluster things and collapse them. And then there's other people where it's just like it's
just spaghetti.
It is the spaghetti.
It's just right, the spaghetti.
Yeah.
And again, it was super surprising. People would do a whole stadium in Grasshopper, and these things would be gigantic.
Yeah,
and we're looking at it like you're not supposed to be able to do that with this.
Right.
But they were happy, so we were good. But and that again, that's part of that pulling us back into architecture, kind of pulling us out of marine. I mean, we're still in marine and jewelry and industrial design, but kind of pulling us back into that the architecture scheme, and it's been years. This is all a really slow process, relative.
Well, you guys have basically, because of your initial ideas about community involvement and making open tools and enabling people to do this, you've really enabled a whole generation of tool makers, which I think is super interesting in the 3D and CAD world, where it's always been kind of product driven. Like you buy the product, it does a certain thing, right? For the most part, a lot of them are designed around that. Especially nowadays in the, there's an app for that kind of mentality. When you're talking about different pieces of hardware that can do different things, like iPads and iPhones and Android devices and stuff, where it is very purpose built as far as an app is concerned. You guys are still on a completely different trajectory than that. You're actually enabling people via your platform to become tool builders. And I think that there's a really interesting thread there, because I think, as an architect myself, there is a certain satisfaction that comes from building a tool that lots of people in my firm are going to use over and over and over again, so that we don't have to, go out and buy that tool. Number one, it does it exactly how we want it. Number two, and people can reuse it, and we do gain some efficiency out of it. Number three, there's not very many tools out there that you can say that that's something you can do with.
Yeah, and I believe that designers need to have control of their tools, and sometimes that means writing your own, and even if they're just little scripts to assist you. And because every design's different, many times those tools need to be a little different too. And with modern development, with .NET and the ability for programs to garbage collect automatically and things like that, it's become really accessible. It doesn't take a computer scientist to have to do this anymore like it did in the C++ days. And so I think it's really important. I had the dean from the AA one time tell me it said everybody coming out, every student graduating from our school needs to be a programmer too.
Wow.
And that was years back.
Yeah, that's what the wow was for. It's like, I'm sure that's not a current statement. That's an older statement, so it's probably ahead of its time.
Yeah, absolutely. And so and it has become so easy to do that. I think it's really important to, again, not be locked into a application that somehow is predicting what you need.
Right.
And because nobody knows, right? The design's the design. It's going to emerge out of this process. And so, how do we deal with that? And how do we come to trust it? Going back to that same thing, is like when I get up every day, I'm going to take this tool and I'm going to solve some design problems, and I have no idea what that design problem is going to be today. right? It could be on a cityscape, or it could be a connector and and something that I'm really, trying to drive. And everything in between. So
interesting. So, okay. So you guys are about to release 7, which is Rhino.Inside is a big part of, right? Up until now, everybody who's using Rhino.Inside is using the whip.
Yep.
And so that comes with its own set of issues, right? Because like in our firm, people who are using Rhino.Inside have to constantly update their whip, and they don't have admin access to their computer. Right. So it'll be really nice on Wednesday when 7 comes out and we can get it into the hands of those people. We don't have to worry so much about constantly updating. But how did you guys get to Rhino.Inside? I'll just leave it at that.
I know. I mean, it's funny. It's just funny. I wish we could. I wish we could say it's predictable, but so one of the things we did with Rhino 7 early on is pulled it apart into pieces, and so we could load it as a DLL inside other applications, just to see what we could do.
Whose idea was that?
Steve Baer is one of the main developers. He was experimenting with, hey, could we do that? And if you look at Rhino now, it's got rhinocore.dll, I think it's called, and that's oddly enough the same size as the whole Rhino 6 application. And then we have this little tiny 100K thing that's Rhino EXE. And all this is weird. Rhino is actually Rhino.Inside itself.
Yeah. So this is an Inception.
That's right. It's a little Inception. Yeah, that's right. So it's Rhino calling Rhino.Inside, and that goes back to everything that we do and release. We try to use ourselves, right? So that makes it well tested and allows everybody in our firm to be both helping the development tools and the application itself. But we were messing around with, okay, now we can load it in different things. What would happen if we loaded it in AutoCAD? What would happen if we loaded it in Adobe Illustrator? What would happen, if we did this, that, and the other thing? And Kike Garcia, who's in Barcelona, he thought, what would happen if we loaded it in Rhino or Revit? And so he hooked it up, and lo and behold, it runs in Revit.
Yeah.
Yeah. And
it's fast.
It's pretty fast.
Like you push a button and it's open. Like,
oh yeah. There's that. There's that. Yeah. And we'll see. As we get more sophisticated, trying to keep it stable and fast is part of the challenge.
Yeah.
But and then what we did is we ran around and showed people, we got Rhino inside Revit. Here's a sphere.
Yeah.
And so we'd show a sphere.
Do that in Revit.
Yeah. Well, and people would look at you like, okay, but I don't need a sphere.
Yeah.
Right? I don't really need a sphere. And so we kind of were experimenting and we didn't have any Revit expertise. And now we do. Son, who does PyRevit, he's part of our team now, and he's been really key. But once we started kind of making levels and floors and walls with Rhino.Inside through Grasshopper, then people were like, oh,
yeah,
that's really interesting.
You get the gears turning, and then they're like, what else? What else do I want to do with this?
Well, and we like to say that, we're going to walk in because people were asking over and over, Rhino to Revit. How do I get Rhino to Revit? How do I get LOD 200 to LOD 300? There's this big break. And file formats, I have to tell you, are a terrible way to communicate between applications because they make a lot of assumptions based on the standard of the file format about what data and what geometry they're going to take and what geometry they're not going to take. And even in the best conditions, it's just a very limited way to communicate between two applications. And before it was all we had, but now we can communicate in a lot of different ways. And for instance, integrating inside the same memory space as the other application. And now you have choice. So maybe, and it can change, or the phases of the project move along, what data you bring across and back, what geometry you're moving back and forth between the two the two parts of the same application. I guess the two interfaces of the same application is really technically what it is.
With different mouse navigation, by the way.
Yeah, I know. Well,
I don't know who to blame for that.
Well, I don't know what
so
we're going to do about
confusing.
that. I get you. So far, nobody's complained about that too much. So we're pretty good. But yeah, I get
left
it.
brain, right brain.
That's right. But the two applications are different that way. So so maybe that's good. You really know where you are. It really now takes you where they're all in the same place. And so you can use Rhino for what Rhino's good for. You can use Revit for what Revit's good for. And you can actually go back and forth. You can I usually like to say that Rhino is really an LOD 200 design product and an LOD 400 fabrication product. That's really where it lives. And Revit is an excellent, BIM tool. It has great drawings. People can do drawings quite quickly in it. And so how do we get those integrated so you can actually fluidly move from your design model to your documentation model to your to your fabrication model? And sometimes that means, for instance, taking geometry out of Revit into the Rhino interface and moving on. Or sometimes that means, there's so many different things, and it's not predictable.
Yeah.
We've been saying that, while we're going to answer a bunch of your questions about Rhino.Inside Revit, we're going to cause about 100 more questions about workflow. What is the workflow and what is the best? And nobody knows.
Yeah.
We're all experimenting.
Yeah, and then you throw Dynamo into the mix, which I hope you guys replace someday. But it just adds more question marks to that equation.
Yeah, and currently, I think there's a lot of differences between Dynamo and Grasshopper, for instance. But the big one, I think, is that Grasshopper has Rhino behind it, so it has really advanced geometry capabilities, and that is, so if you have to need something with design and geometry and things like that. Seems like it's working. Yeah. We've never had this much excitement about a product, by the way. Rhino.Inside Revit is...
Well, this has been the topic du jour for the last 10 years at Autodesk University, right? Like, it's just interoperability is... I could see the excitement here because you guys have just like taken the bull by the horns and said, you know what, we're going to do it. Because there's been so many attempts and I don't want to say failures, but it's because it's all process to get to where we are now.
It's all process.
But I think there's probably a lot of relief mixed up with that excitement that you guys are the ones doing it.
Well, I think I don't think there's a lot of CAD companies that are crazy enough to integrate their CAD application inside another one. I mean, that's just nuts.
Yeah. Yeah, you guys took an entire platform and made it a plugin, right? Like that's,
right, exactly. Yeah. Right. And Rhino's always tried to be a complement to applications, never really tried to be kind of like you use just Rhino and nothing else.
Yeah.
And so it's really worked well. It's been surprising. I've learned a lot about Revit, and it's amazing how much I use them. I use both interfaces at the same, kind of like within the same process,
right?
And we joke a little bit that it used to be you had the Rhino people in one room and the Revit people in another, right? Because there's two workflows.
Right.
Now they're actually in the same room now. Actually talking about one workflow. Yeah. Unfortunately, I can't get them to not sit on both sides of the table, right? So there's Rhino people on this side of the table. Anyway. Someday. Yeah. That's right. All right, everybody. We're getting alternate. Yeah. Rhino Revit. Get to know your neighbor.
Musical chairs. Yeah.
That's right.
So, like you said it a little bit earlier, but obviously Rhino.Inside is not just about Revit. So, what other excitement have you seen and possibility? I mean, there's a lot, right?
Yeah. So we have, we have an experiment in Blender. We have an experiment in Adobe Illustrator. We have an experiment in AutoCAD. A really, really big one is in ArchiCAD. So, and it's not actually Rhino.Inside, it's a direct connect. It's a, a communications tool. And they've been doing that. It's been very good. What's interesting now is because you have Rhino.Inside Revit, and then you have a direct connect to ArchiCAD, you can actually sync the two models.
Oh my gosh.
Right? Because now the BIM information, not only geometry, right, but BIM information can pass back and forth real time. It is crazy. You don't have to use IFC to communicate between them if you don't want, right? You can wire up with Grasshopper how the information in this application shows up as in this other application.
It's like mapping a database to it.
Yeah. And using Grasshopper to do that.
Yeah.
And then a Tekla, there's a Tekla direct connection, which has been, we've been watching bridges, reinforced concrete, those kinds of things, all driven by Grasshopper.
Yeah. Wow.
And so, it's exploded for us. And then the last piece that's interesting is we have a web application framework that is Rhino.Inside sitting behind a REST API. So now you can use Rhino common commands just by making HTTP requests across the web.
And you guys are also doing Rhino Compute, right?
That's compute.
Okay,
right.
that is
so
compute.
That's compute. So
that's
compute
amazing.
is And so the possibilities have been mind-boggling. And it's, we're experimenting. All of this stuff is under development. All this stuff is an experiment. We're trying to see, what people like and what people find useful, and continue to push those. And then things that people don't find useful, we'll just, we kind of drop.
So, okay. So that's a perfect segue. If you're willing to go down that, is like, obviously not every experiment is a hit. What are some things that you thought maybe had some promise, if you could take us down, like that just didn't go anywhere?
Scanning to solids is been it's not that it hasn't, never say never
yet,
right?
Yeah, just put
right
asterisk in there. Yeah.
Right. But, scan points to meshes, to NURBS, which Rhino 7's got a lot of tools to help with that. But it's just, there's so many, a lot of times the data sets aren't as clean as anybody would like. And then, you kind of go through this process of trying to clean them up, and that's a lot more effort than anybody would like to do. And so I think that's an area that we pushed a little into, and we still have some tools for it, but I think that's a lot harder process in reality than people would like it to be. A lot of times people want to save time over their traditional methods, but it's still hard. Yeah. It's harder than they'd like, and so that's an area. Most of the stuff that we do dies so quickly when nobody cares.
Fail fast.
That's right. Well, and that's important, right? We're not a big company, so we do have to fail fast when we're trying something that isn't useful. So VR continues. I think what's interesting is, and we're not really on the cutting edge a lot. So we're supporting people that are. So VR and rendering is, our rendering tools are better in 7, but just standard static rendering may not be
that's the rendering from the days of old.
Yeah, exactly.
Now it's all real time, all the time. Right.
And if it's not moving, if your rendering's not moving, it's not a rendering anymore, I think.
It's interesting, yeah.
Yeah, it's very interesting,
It for me, it's interesting coming from the architectural and design side of things, in that it forces an honesty about the design that is much different than it used to when you would curate a frame and a perspective.
And layer it with Photoshop and make it.
And so now it's like, well, if you're putting it in the hands of the user or the client and letting the client drive around potentially, and they can look wherever they want, it doesn't mean it all has to be done, but you have to be able to have that conversation at any moment to say, when they point at something and say, what's that, right? And before, it was like, no, I'm going to pick this very specific view because I'm only modeling what you're going to see. And now I think that's very different with VR, with real time.
Yeah. And we're seeing, we're hearing stories of people using, the VR tools or Inkscape or Twin Motion or whatever it is actually on the screen at the same time, so you got Rhino here and then you're looking at, it's almost like it's just another viewport.
Yeah.
It's all of a sudden it's like everything's got to look like it's on TV.
Yeah. High production value. Yeah. For sure.
Yeah. Cars are moving and people are walking around and it's like, this doesn't really exist, but it's very, very interesting time right now for that.
And you guys are also kind of plugging into now by putting all this stuff on the web. you're plugging into other services, right? So there's analysis engines out there. I'm assuming there's like CFD, kind of all kinds of stuff that you guys can tap into because of just the way that the APIs are talking to each other and the way you can hook things up nowadays.
Yep, they're all there, and they're all real, and they're real time, and it's crazy. I mean, we can't keep up, but and it's not us doing it; it's other people doing it to Rhino. But it's all these ideas of microservices, or Ladybug's a great example, and the new pollination product they have. There's a bunch of CFD now, so there's an awful lot, pedestrian simulations and view simulations and all those things. That you might want to do. Hooking it to Power BI, right? Nathan's work, Nathan Miller's work. So there's a lot to do. I mean, it's exciting because kind of feel like architectural tools kind of stagnated a bit. Revit's been around for a long time, and it's not that Revit stagnates, but just the kind of like, and the ideas behind Revit aren't necessarily new. It's kind of like stuck, and now rendering's on the run, and integrating products together is on the run. I mean, forget the word interoperability. We're going to call it integration now, right? And then the going on the web and just all of these things, being able to take even larger models, even though we can still kill a machine with the model because it's too big. But it's pretty cool. There's a lot going on right now, and I think that's very exciting. Being able to develop your own tools. It's gotten so much easier in the last few years.
Yeah.
It's time to step back and evaluate what our workflow really is. Because there's so many new opportunities.
Yeah, it seems like you're saying, it's super exciting both on the software side of things, but also on the hardware side of things, because we're seeing stuff like the new Apple M1 chip where it's flying. It's just you're going to actually be able to get 12 hours on a laptop on an all-day trip and not have to worry about plugging it in while really loading the computer with the types of things that we're talking about, like pro users are using. Are you guys excited about hardware developments like you are about what's going on in software? Or I can assume that you're way more software biased, but
no. I mean, hardware's great, except for M1 is a good example. It's a different chip, and it's hard. It's hard.
Yeah.
It's we can get it to run, but we can't get it to run well, and we can't get it to run fast, and it's just because it's just a very discontinuous development. And so in that ways, it's kind of a love-hate relationship. We like the fact that things are getting faster because we can only optimize so much,
right?
And the hardware does need to get faster, but at the same time, it's really it's going to take some time.
It's a big side project all of a sudden.
Yeah. Oh yeah. So if currently we don't support M1s, we've got them in house and we're working on it, but Rhino 6 will never support M1s, and Rhino 7 we're working on it. I mean, but it, we have no idea how long it's going to take. And so, the biggest thing I can tell your listeners is don't buy an M1 if you want to run Rhino right now. Not that we don't like M1s. It's just, it's going to take a while.
It's not there yet. Yeah. I do run Rhino on a Mac right now. And I personally love like the trackpad integration that you guys have. It's so good, right? Like just the ability to pinch and zoom and swipe and do all those things. So because the trackpad is such a large piece of hardware on a laptop chassis, it's so big, like you can't avoid using it. It's fantastic. It seems like you guys went through the extra steps to make that a good experience for those of us who are probably a minority in your user base, but still it's fantastic.
Yeah, thanks. And customers pulled us through to get it right.
Yeah.
Kept telling us wrong again, wrong, still wrong.
Yeah.
And that pushes us to try to do better. But I guess the other thing too is, Macs or Apple's still selling Intel Macs.
Oh yeah, for a while.
For a while.
I think they said a couple years to go through this transition.
Yeah. So we still, we're still recommending the Intel Macs. They're always we always thought they were good machines.
Yeah.
But anyway.
Yeah, cool. Well, I'm excited about where you guys are headed, and I'm really excited about version 7 coming out on Wednesday. I mean, I'm sure you guys are too, and then you guys are jumping right into 8, which is amazing. So, yeah, there's a lot of great stuff on the horizon for McNeel and Associates here.
Thank you. It's super exciting for us. I mean, it's really fired us up. People have been there for a long time, are just like running around, just excited about what they're working on, and just realizing, the kind of feedback we're getting has been unbelievable. And so that's been really exciting for everybody.
Well, thank you for making a tool that people love using. You talked a minute ago about that stagnation, and honestly, if it's a slog to go work in a piece of software every day, that's probably a big reason why there was that stagnation. So by you guys engaging with the community and just making something so open, and there's so much communication around it. And, I've had Andrew Heumann on the show and Nathan Miller and, people who are obviously huge advocates for what you guys are doing. And with the products that they build on a daily basis today, still, Grasshopper being direct, you can translate a script right into Hypar. And Nate is doing amazing stuff with semantic and pushing Rhino geometry into Revit. That was Conveyor actually, but there's so many great tools that revolve around this kind of ecosystem that you guys have developed. It's a pleasure to talk to you about it. It's been really fun.
Thanks.
So before we take off, I just want to give you the opportunity to provide, where can people find out more? How can they get on your newsletter to be updated when the announcements go out? What's the best way to follow along with what you're doing with Rhino?
So anytime you download Rhino, you get, if you'd like, you can give us your email. And so download Rhino or Rhino.Inside or anything. And then you're on that list based on kind of what you downloaded. So we can give you appropriate information. And then there's, Rhino3D.com. You can go there. Your local dealer has Rhino. So if you want to upgrade your Rhino 7 from Rhino 6, local dealers can do that right now. And then there's a Rhino.Inside Revit. You can just Google it, Rhino.Inside Revit. There's a Rhino.Inside Revit website that has a lot of information about Rhino.Inside Revit, how to use it, and lots of demonstrations and videos, and a community page of many, many people that have been experimenting with it, using it, and trying to teach others. And I would highly recommend going there. You can download the application. Rhino.Inside Revit it's you buy Rhino 7 and you have Revit, and that's all you need, or that's all you buy. Right. And then there's a little plugin, open source plugin, that's just Rhino.Inside Revit that you can download.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much, Scott. It's been a fantastic conversation. I appreciate your time.
Definitely. We should do it again.
All right.
So
talk to you soon.
Thank you very much. Bye.
Thanks for hanging out with us today. This show is part of the Gable Media Podcast Network. You can see all the shows at gablemedia.com. That's GABLMEDIA.com. You can help support what I'm doing here by leaving a 5-star review on Apple Podcasts to help get the word out, and of course, share it with your friends. I'd love to hear from you, so leave a comment on the website at trxl.co/podcast, where you can find every episode. You can also follow me on Twitter and Instagram and YouTube. Just search for eTroxel. Talk to you soon.